Self-discipline begins in the part of the brain that governs our ability to plan, control impulses, and regulate emotions. This area, known as the prefrontal cortex, is the command center for executive functions. When activated consistently, it allows us to override temptations in favor of long-term goals. It's the reason someone wakes up early to work out rather than sleep in. It's the same force that keeps a student studying instead of scrolling through social media. But the key isn't to wait for motivation to strike. It's to train this region to act regardless of how you feel. Every time you resist a distraction, you strengthen the neural pathways in this region. These circuits are like muscles. The more you use them, the more reliable they become. Self-discipline isn't about magic moments of inspiration. It's a biological training process of refining neural control. When you consistently take action in the face of discomfort, you're reinforcing these brain circuits in a very physical way. Each decision to delay gratification or endure short-term pain for a long-term benefit builds synaptic strength in the prefrontal cortex. Think of it like forging a path in a forest. The more you walk it, the clearer and more automatic it becomes. At first, these choices feel effortful and unnatural. But over time, as the brain adapts, they become second nature. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain's ability to rewire itself through behavior. What starts as forced discipline gradually turns into who you are. Not because of willpower, but because your brain adapts to the routines you commit to daily. Discipline is often mistaken for a personality trait, when in reality it's a biological capability developed through repetition. When you understand that your brain is changeable, the path to control becomes clearer. The discomfort you feel when doing something hard isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that your brain is adapting. Every time you resist an impulse, you're nudging your prefrontal cortex to strengthen control over the emotional centers of the brain, like the amygdala. This internal tug-of-war can feel exhausting, but that friction is a necessary part of growth. And that means your brain is learning to override reactive behavior. The more frequently you experience and conquer this friction, the less effort future resistance will require. What makes the prefrontal cortex truly powerful is that it can suppress urges that feel overwhelmingly automatic. Consider cravings, procrastination, or emotional outbursts. These all arise from more primitive brain regions. But when the prefrontal cortex is activated, it sends inhibitory signals that reduce the strength of these impulses. This allows you to pause, reflect, and choose the better path, even if it's more difficult. The difference between those who follow through on their goals and those who give in to distraction often lies in how efficiently they can engage this circuit. And like anything trainable, it depends on deliberate and repeated use. No one is born with an unshakable prefrontal cortex, but anyone can build one through consistent effort. The most effective way to train this brain region is by creating conditions that demand effortful control. Waking up early and resisting the snooze button is one. Completing a hard workout when you don't feel like it is another. Saying no to comfort foods or digital distractions are also great examples. Each of these moments requires you to override what feels good now for what benefits you later. By stringing these moments together, you create a cascade of neural reinforcement. Over time, your brain becomes more efficient at making hard decisions feel easier. This is the real mechanism behind mental toughness. Not grit in the abstract, but a brain trained to default to discipline. Interestingly, the brain doesn't just change functionally, it changes structurally. With consistent effort, the thickness and connectivity of the prefrontal cortex improve, Imaging studies have shown that those who regularly practice self-control have denser gray matter in this area. That means more neurons and stronger connections. This is proof that discipline isn't about being naturally strong-minded. It's about building the mental hardware to support consistent decisions. When your brain is set up for success, your behaviors follow more smoothly. Discipline becomes less about forcing outcomes and more about responding predictably, even in difficult conditions. Another powerful tool is friction, placing yourself in situations where you're forced to choose between what's easy and what's right. These micro decisions accumulate and eventually become part of your identity. For example, sitting in silence with your thoughts instead of grabbing your phone gives your brain time to practice patience. Walking when you'd rather drive engages effort where convenience usually rules. Each of these decisions is an opportunity to reinforce neural pathways that favor discipline. Over time, your threshold for discomfort rises. You're no longer fighting against your environment, you're becoming someone who thrives in it. But discipline is not about perfection. The brain thrives on consistency, not intensity. Missing a day or making a mistake isn't what derails discipline. It's the story you attach to the lap. If you view it as a signal to quit, those neural patterns of avoidance get stronger. But if you treat it as part of the learning curve, the brain keeps adjusting and strengthening. What matters most is returning to the path quickly. The repetition is what rewires your brain. Not just success, but the willingness to keep showing up. Self-discipline then is more about recovery than rigidity. Lastly, it's important to understand that your environment influences your brain's discipline circuits too. Surroundings that are filled with distractions, temptations, and unpredictability make it harder to activate the prefrontal cortex. This doesn't mean avoiding challenge. It means engineering your space to support your goals. That might mean putting your phone in another room, using time blocks for focused work, or designing routines that require minimal decision-making. The easier you make it to engage in deliberate behavior, the more often your brain will choose the harder but better path. That's how you build self-discipline. Not by waiting to feel strong, but by training your brain to become strong through daily design and deliberate friction. Most people misunderstand how dopamine works. It's often thought of as the reward chemical, something that floods the brain after achieving a goal or experiencing pleasure. But in truth, dopamine's primary role is not to reward, but to drive motivation. It is released in anticipation of a reward, not just in response to one. This makes dopamine a powerful tool for building discipline, not through outcomes, but through effort. When you begin to associate the release of dopamine with taking action rather than just winning or finishing, you shift your relationship with hard work. It's not about waiting for success to feel good. It's about learning to feel good while pursuing it. This is a critical shift because it means your brain can be trained to crave challenge. You're no longer dependent on external validation or results. You become addicted to progress itself. Every time you begin a task that feels difficult or uncomfortable, your brain initially resists. This resistance often comes from deeper, older regions of the brain that prefer energy conservation and immediate gratification. However, when you push through the discomfort and initiate action, you trigger a cascade of dopamine that reinforces that choice. Over time, your brain learns that discomfort can precede something rewarding. This is where discipline becomes neurological, not emotional. The repetition of choosing action despite resistance strengthens the neural pathways that link challenge with reward. Eventually, those early moments of friction become less painful and more anticipated. The brain starts expecting reward on the other side of effort. That's how it becomes easier to start, even if the work remains difficult. This process depends heavily on where you allow your dopamine to come from. In today's environment, it's easy to train your brain to expect dopamine from fast, shallow experiences, likes, messages, snacks. But these quick hits train the brain to avoid anything that requires deep focus or sustained effort. Self-discipline means taking back control over what triggers dopamine in your system. It means rewiring your reward system so that progress, repetition, and delayed outcomes feel satisfying. That may sound difficult, but it's entirely possible. The key is in the framing. When you start to mentally link effort to identity and grind to growth, the brain follows that narrative. The story you tell yourself during challenge becomes the chemical reality in your brain. One of the most effective ways to shift this internal chemistry is by rewarding yourself for the process, not the outcome. Let your internal dialogue reinforce the action. I'm proud I started, or that was hard, but I stayed with it. These small internal wins trigger dopamine spikes that aren't tied to the finish line, but to the starting line. This fundamentally changes your relationship with discipline. Instead of needing to complete a big goal to feel good, you feel good every time you honor the routine. This also makes setbacks less emotionally charged. If progress is the reward, then even a hard day becomes a win if you showed up and tried. You take the power away from external success and put it in the consistency of effort. What makes this even more powerful is that dopamine has a feedback effect on attention and energy. When dopamine rises in response to effort, it doesn't just feel good, it sharpens focus and increases persistence. That's why people who build discipline often seem more energized and clear-headed. Their brain has learned to generate the chemicals necessary for staying the course. It becomes a self-sustaining system. Effort generates dopamine, dopamine improves focus, and focus improves effort. The challenge isn't to find motivation, it's to initiate movement, which then awakens the very chemistry that sustains it. This is a biological loop that anyone can activate through repetition, even on the days when it feels hardest to begin. The best part of this mechanism is that it works regardless of your current level. Whether you're just starting to build habits or refining high-level discipline, this loop applies. Every micro action counts. Sitting down to write, lacing up your shoes, turning off distractions. When you mentally acknowledge those steps and associate them with progress, you teach your brain to crave those same steps tomorrow. That's how daily discipline is built. Not in giant leaps, but in tiny wins that the brain learns to love. Over time, what once felt like effort becomes normal, and what once required willpower becomes automatic, not because the task changed, but because your brain's chemistry did. Discipline also becomes more resilient when you reduce your reliance on unpredictable or external dopamine sources. When your sense of reward comes from others' approval or outcomes you can't fully control, your motivation becomes fragile. But when your reward comes from showing up, putting in reps, and embracing the difficulty, no one can take that from you. Your internal world becomes your fuel. This also builds confidence at a deeper level. Not based on performance, but based on identity. You begin to trust yourself not because you always win, but because you always act. This shift stabilizes your emotional response to setbacks. You no longer fear failure because effort is enough to keep your dopamine system engaged. Many people chase peak states without understanding that they can be trained into them. You don't have to rely on sudden bursts of inspiration or lucky streaks. Instead, you can train your brain to enter flow states by consistently activating effort-based dopamine that starts by enjoying the process more than the product. It's about falling in love with training more than trophies. This doesn't mean goals don't matter, they do, but the goals become guideposts, not the only source of satisfaction. With this mindset, discipline feels less like deprivation and more like freedom. You're free from the highs and lows of random outcomes and grounded in the steady rhythm of effort. It's important to recognize that this is not an overnight shift. Rewiring your brain's reward system takes time, consistency, and conscious direction. But the beauty of the human nervous system is that it's always adapting. Every day you make a disciplined choice, you send a chemical message that hard things are worth it. Every moment of effort is a signal to your brain that this is who you are becoming. The key is to keep showing up, even imperfectly, because the brain doesn't need perfection to adapt. It needs repetition. Even small actions compound, especially when paired with internal celebration. That's how true self-discipline is formed from the inside out, molecule by molecule. Eventually, the need to push yourself fades and is replaced by a pull, a neurological craving to do hard things because your brain has been taught that they are meaningful. You don't wait for perfect conditions. You begin to feel unsettled when you're not living in alignment with your effort-based identity. That's not motivational fluff. It's a neurochemical baseline you've raised through training. This is where discipline becomes joy and grind becomes growth. The hard becomes the habit, and your brain, once wired for comfort, becomes your greatest ally in the pursuit of your highest potential. Self-discipline isn't about avoiding stress. It's about knowing how to work with it. When we encounter discomfort, the brain activates the sympathetic nervous system, launching a cascade of chemicals that increase alertness and readiness. This is often labeled as stress, and most people view it as something to run from. But when framed and used correctly, this physiological state becomes a tool. The body prepares you for challenge by releasing adrenaline and increasing your breathing rate. These reactions aren't signs of weakness, they're signs that your system is ready to act. Instead of avoiding this state, self-disciplined individuals learn how to step into it with awareness. They interpret stress not as a threat, but as a signal to move forward. This shift in perception turns discomfort into an ally instead of an enemy. Learning to harness this response starts by recognizing that all stress isn't the same. There's toxic stress, which overwhelms and paralyzes. And then there's controlled stress. Short, intense periods that signal adaptation. Voluntarily placing yourself in uncomfortable conditions like cold exposure, intense physical effort, or deep focus work creates a hormetic response. This means that your body gets stronger as a result of facing manageable challenges. Over time, your nervous system adapts to these conditions and becomes less reactive. You teach your body and mind to stay calm under pressure. This kind of training builds not only resilience, but also clarity, because your system stops overreacting to mild discomfort. It becomes a recalibration tool for stress tolerance. Breath control is one of the most effective ways to regulate this stress response. When stress hits, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, which further amplifies anxiety. But by slowing your exhale and becoming intentional with your breath, you can send a signal to the brain that you are in control. This changes the chemical cocktail inside your body. Cortisol drops, heart rate stabilizes, and the parasympathetic system starts to engage. This biological shift gives you back cognitive control, allowing the prefrontal cortex to function properly. With this regained control, decision-making improves, and reaction turns into response. Breath becomes more than survival. It becomes a remote control for your mental state. In the face of chaos, a few deep breaths can restore discipline. Body posture also plays a hidden but critical role in how stress impacts self-discipline. Slouched, closed postures signal to the brain that you are in retreat or submission. In contrast, upright, open posture sends a cue of readiness and alertness. This isn't about looking confident for others. It's about sending the right messages through your own nervous system. When you change your physical stance, you can shift your internal state. Standing tall with intention can actually reduce feelings of threat and hesitation. It gives your body the feedback it needs to engage with challenge rather than back away from it. This simple adjustment can set the tone for how you face your daily tasks, turning avoidance into engagement. Deliberately taking on short, stressful activities builds your threshold for discomfort. This could mean taking a cold shower in the morning, pushing past a physical limit, or tackling a task you've been avoiding. These acts of voluntary struggle recalibrate your stress response. They teach your brain that intensity is not always danger, it can be growth. With each exposure, the nervous system becomes less sensitive to discomfort. You become more capable of staying grounded during real-world challenges. What once caused panic or avoidance now becomes manageable. This adaptability is the heart of self-discipline. Developing a nervous system that sees pressure as preparation, not panic. Focus also plays a key role in transforming stress into discipline. The brain has limited attentional bandwidth, and where you place your focus determines your perception of stress. If you focus on fear or discomfort, the stress response amplifies. But if you direct your attention toward action or breath, the perceived threat shrinks. This is why mentally rehearsing or visualizing a task before it happens can reduce stress and improve follow-through. It gives the brain a roadmap to follow, minimizing panic in the moment. Focus becomes a lever you can pull to redirect energy and emotion. In high-pressure moments, those who maintain focus also maintain access to discipline. It's not about removing stress, but mastering where you place your mental energy when it arises. Another powerful shift happens when you begin to seek out stress voluntarily. When you know that temporary discomfort leads to long-term gains, you stop avoiding it. You may even begin to look forward to it, knowing it will make you stronger. This is the exact opposite of how most people treat stress, as something to escape or numb. But in the realm of self-discipline, stress becomes a training partner. Each bout of voluntary hardship gives you more data, more confidence, and more capacity. You stop fearing failure because you've conditioned your system to face resistance with control. It doesn't mean you become emotionless. It means emotions no longer control your behavior. Rituals help prepare the brain to enter and exit states of controlled stress. A pre-tack routine like breathing, stretching, or a short mantra can create psychological readiness. These actions tell your system, we're entering the zone now. Likewise, a post-tack routine can help return the body to baseline. This is crucial because if you stay stuck in high elect mode, you eventually burn out. The balance between effort and recovery is what makes discipline sustainable. It's a cycle: stress, focus, action, release. When done right, you don't dread the next challenge. You prepare for it with purpose. This rhythm prevents exhaustion and builds long-term performance without draining your emotional resources. One of the biggest benefits of building stress resilience is that it makes you harder to distract. Distractions often win because we use them to escape mild discomfort. But when you become comfortable with discomfort, you stop needing the escape. You can stay in hard conversations, complete boring tasks, and push through challenging workouts without mentally checking out. This makes discipline less fragile. Your emotional stability doesn't depend on everything feeling easy or smooth. You become anchored in something deeper than just preference. You're rooted in the ability to stay steady, no matter what shows up. That steadiness is what sets disciplined minds apart from reactive ones. Ultimately, stress is not something to be feared or suppressed. It's something to be understood and strategically used. The nervous system was designed to help you meet challenges, not to keep you comfortable. When you learn to regulate and lean into controlled stress, you gain a new level of influence over your actions. You are no longer ruled by mood, energy, or fear. You're led by a trained, adaptable nervous system. Self-discipline becomes less about forcing and more about flowing with challenge. This is the biology of grit, the ability to enter stress and come out strong. With time, practice, and intention, your response to discomfort becomes your greatest asset in building a resilient and unstoppable mind. Most people think self-discipline is just about willpower, but it's really about structure. The brain thrives on patterns, and when it knows what to expect, it uses less energy deciding what to do. Decision fatigue is one of the biggest enemies of discipline. Every time you ask yourself whether to do something, you open the door to hesitation and excuses. But when your day is structured with routines and clear intentions, your brain doesn't debate, it executes. That's why the most disciplined people don't rely on mood or motivation. They build environments where the default action is the right one. Habits remove friction and structure protects them. You don't need to feel inspired when your system is already in motion. The structure begins with the way you design your day. Morning routines, work blocks, breaks, and nighttime rituals all serve to reduce uncertainty. When you wake up and immediately know your first task, the brain can shift into action without internal conflict. This doesn't mean your schedule has to be rigid, but it should be deliberate. Planning your day in advance removes emotional decisions from the equation. It also builds trust with yourself. When you say you'll do something and actually do it, your brain registers that as evidence. Over time, this repetition reinforces identity. You start seeing yourself as someone who follows through, which becomes a self-fulfilling system. Small wins stack up into confidence. Innovation also plays a major role in supporting discipline. If your surroundings are filled with distractions, your brain is constantly battling temptation. But when your environment is aligned with your goals, the right actions become effortless. For example, if your phone is always within reach, your attention will naturally wander. But if you create a workspace that minimizes interruptions and signals focus, your brain will match that cue. Design your space to reduce friction for good habits and increase friction for bad ones. Keep your tools for deep work visible and your distractions out of reach. Make healthy behaviors the default. Environment isn't just physical, it's mental. Guard your inputs because what you consume shapes your focus and energy. Another element of structure is time blocking. When you assign specific hours to specific tasks, you create psychological safety. Your brain knows it won't have to juggle 1,000 priorities all day. This containment reduces stress and increases focus. Instead of reacting to everything that shows up, you operate with intention. Even if something unexpected comes up, you know how to reorganize without derailing the entire day. Time ballooning also gives you permission to rest because it defines boundaries. Without structure, rest turns into guilt or avoidance. But within a system, recovery becomes strategic. You're not being lazy, you're following the plan. This rhythm between effort and pause fuels consistent performance. Discipline also strengthens when you set clear behavioral rules for yourself. These rules act as commitments you no longer negotiate. For example, I don't check my phone before 9 a.m. or I always stretch before working out. These aren't restrictions, they're identity reinforcements. Each time you honor a personal rule, your brain receives feedback. This is who I am. And when the rules are followed consistently, they require less thought over time. The mental load decreases and action becomes automatic. The trick is to make these rules simple and repeatable. Complexity is the enemy of consistency. When your rules are clear, your actions follow more easily. This is how you build self-discipline that doesn't rely on constant effort. Accountability is another tool that fits inside structure. When no one knows what you're trying to do, it's easier to slip. But when you have public or private accountability, whether that's a friend, a journal, or a calendar, you give yourself a mirror. You can see where you're following through and where you're drifting. Self-tracking can be powerful because it gives your brain tangible data. A visual record of success reinforces behavior at a neural level. You're not just trying to be disciplined in theory. You're seeing it happen in real time. Even missing a day becomes feedback, not failure. Structure helps you catch the slip early before it becomes a slide. And because you've defined your goals clearly, course correction becomes simpler. Structure also involves pre-committing to difficult actions. One way to do this is by setting up your environment the night before. If you lay out your workout clothes or preload your tasks for the morning, you remove the early resistance. The fewer choices you have to make at the start of the day, the faster you shift into motion. Another method is using mental rehearsal. By visualizing your ideal morning or focused work session, you prime your brain for follow-through. These small acts of preparation send a message. Tomorrow's discipline starts now. The more you prepare, the less you rely on emotional energy to act. Structure creates momentum. And momentum keeps you going when your energy dips. Sleep and recovery must also be part of your structure. The brain's ability to stay disciplined relies heavily on its access to energy and clarity. When you're sleep deprived, your impulse control drops and your cravings rise. This makes structure harder to maintain, but when you protect your rest as seriously as your work, you give yourself the fuel to keep showing up. A consistent bedtime, reduced screen time at night, and morning exposure to natural light can reinforce your biological rhythm. This rhythm, in turn, supports your behavioral rhythm. Discipline starts to feel natural, not forced. Structure supports biology, and biology supports consistency. The final piece of structure is self-review. Without reflection, it's easy to drift. A short daily or weekly review helps you identify what worked and what didn't. It keeps your system aligned with your evolving goals. When you review your progress, you activate the brain's learning systems. You turn discipline into a dynamic process, not a rigid routine. Self-awareness improves, and future actions become smarter. Even if the review is just 5 minutes at the end of the day, it strengthens your focus. Discipline becomes less about grinding and more about adjusting. You're not trying to be perfect, you're trying to stay aligned. That alignment is the goal of structure. In the end, self-discipline is less about forcing yourself and more about designing a system that pulls you forward. Structure creates freedom by removing chaos. It gives your brain clarity, reduces internal debate, and builds confidence through consistency. When your life has intentional design, you stop negotiating with yourself, you stop relying on bursts of willpower, and start living in rhythm. Structure may not feel exciting, but it is the silent force behind all greatness. It is the foundation that turns intention into execution and vision into reality. With the right structure in place, self-discipline stops being a struggle and becomes a way of life.